Yeah, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Daniel Goldberg to talk about unreasonable demands for proof of causation and the manufacture of doubt. So I originally became aware of Daniel's work, as is often the way now, through Twitter. It was a particularly fascinating thread, and at the end I asked if he would consider giving a talk in approximately that area, and happily said yes. I realize this is a bit of an aside, but honestly, if you're looking for sort of pithy, insightful public health policy commentary, to follow him. But yes, apparently, in addition to producing such great public health commentary on Twitter, he is also, in fact, an associate professor at the University of Colorado Center for Bioethics and Humanities, where in addition to being, I guess, historian of medicine, a public health ethicist, he actually trained as an attorney. So a few different hats. And I think unsurprisingly, that means Daniel's work tends to be at the intersection of law, policy, bioethics, and from my experience, at least of stalking your tweets, social justice and public health policy. I don't know that there's much benefit to me continuing to talk, so maybe I'll just hand it over to you to take it away, Daniel.
Thanks for the introduction, and I'm excited to speak in the Hidden Epidemic series. So I do have some slides. I'm going to go ahead and share them if that's okay. I look forward to the conversation. Many of the ideas that I'll be talking about here are based on a book manuscript that I've submitted a complete draft of. So it's still, unfortunately, quite a bit of ways, I think, from seeing the light of day. Sadly, because it still has to go through review and things like that. So I think we're a little ways off, but I've been working on those ideas for some time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and we'll get going. Unreasonable demands for proof of causation and the manufacture of doubt. So what do I mean, first of all, by thinking about the manufacture of doubt, right? So I tend to, as sort of Freya mentioned in her very kind introduction, right? I tend to think historically about a lot of these kinds of things as it relates to public health law, as it relates to public health ethics, public health policy. Unfortunately, I don't get, I'm not always paid to sort of sit in archives. That's not the nature of my position, fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be. But I do tend to sort of think historically about a lot of these kinds of problems. So one of the things that sort of the ideas I've been developing for some time now about the manufacture of doubt, and I'll explain what I mean by manufacture of doubt. I'm not just sort of throwing it out there, but the important thing is to see it as a historical, not an artifact because it's alive, but the term that I prefer is script, right? And what do I mean by script, right? And so if we're thinking about products introduced into the stream of commerce by regulated industries, right? Since industrialization and urbanization in the West, right? So, beginning in the late 18th, early 19th century in particular is the dates I'm sort of thinking of, regulated industries accused of marketing products that are injurious to public and population health. They have long sought to manufacture doubt. I'll explain sort of in the course of today's talk, what do I mean by manufacturing doubt? How have they sought to do it? Where have they sought to do it, right? And so these are things that I'm going to explain. But this isn't meant in some kind of sort of ethereal, sort of very sort of abstract conceptual way, right? There are some I'm a public health person, which means I'm a ruthless pragmatist, right? So I'm really concerned, and I'm really only thinking, oops, is that, sorry, it's very bright here in Denver. I can see some spots on my screen. Hold on one second. I apologize. I should have checked oh, no, they're still there. I should have checked the lighting before I began. Hold on one second. All right, let's try that. Seems better. Sorry about that. The sun is very, very strong at almost 3,000 meters high in Denver, right? So I apologize for that. So the point is that these regulated industries, and that's the actors I'm primarily going to be talking about today, are regulated industries. They have global reach, so it's not just North American and US based, although I will talk a little bit about that. But these industries have sought to manufacture doubt for some very sort of basic and very concrete reasons, which is to advance their social, political, and economic goals. So really today, what I'm talking about is political economy. right? The political economy in which these regulated industries are manufacturing, marketing, selling, distributing whatever goods they're seeking to introduce into the stream of commerce in order to meet their goals, which are social, political, and of course, primarily commercial and economic. It has become advantageous for these companies to manufacture doubt. And we can trace this back to at least as far back as the mid to late 19th century in the West. Why? Right? What how has this happened? Right? And so the manufacture of doubt is another term with which the group may be more familiar, or the audience may be more familiar, is sometimes called the construction of agnotology, the intentional construction of ignorance. It's an effort to create ignorance. I mean, I really love the title of this research group, right? Hidden epidemics, right? It is a sort of an effort to hide or suppress certain kinds of things, right? Why? The key to me to understand is that different regulated industries across time and space all over the planet, primarily Western in origin, but they're operating everywhere. It's not just operating in a US or a North American context in particular. They are following and enacting and reifying an historical script. And there are, of course, differences, as I'll go on to explain into, how the script is being performed and enacted. And there's all sorts of different parts of the script. And some regulated industries are doing more of some than the other. And many aspects, for those of you who are wondering, of this historical script has been perfected primarily by the tobacco industry in particular, right? And that's where this idea of agnotology, that this construction of ignorance, is a term phrased by Robert Proctor, right, when he was talking about the tobacco industry, as it turns out, historian Robert Proctor, right? But regulated industries perform and enact the manufacture of doubt again and again and again, because it facilitates their political and economic objectives. So what are their economic objectives, right? What are their political and social objectives for these regulated industries? And of course, they vary across time and space and industry. They're not always the same, but we can definitely trace some common patterns historically, right? And legally and politically. And one of the primary goals in the manufacture of doubt is to what's called create and sustain regulatory vacuums. Now, again, I'm qualifying a lot of what I say because none of this is hard and fast rules, right? I mean, social life is complex. I know you're an anthropologist, so you know this a lot better than I do, right? But so it's not sort of uniform, but what really a lot of these regulated industries, what they really want to do is they want to prevent public health regulation, right? In particular, right? Because public health regulations constrain and constrict their political, social, and primarily commercial objectives, right? If there are all sorts of requirements for how products can be marketed or sold, or sometimes there are outright bans on the sale and marketing of particular classes or kinds of products if they're deemed to pose too significant risks for public and population health, or for marginalized and oppressed communities, they can't sell their products, or it becomes much more expensive to sell their products. And so the effort is often to create and sustain these regulatory vacuums, these spaces in which public health governance, population health governance in particular, and in particular, we're thinking in a Western context, and perhaps especially in a North American context, of what's been referred to as the administrative state, the regulatory state. The regulatory state is as small as possible in the spaces in which the regulated industries are trying to operate. That's oftentimes the goal, to preserve a status quo, for example, in which regulation isn't going on. So the underlying book project on which some of this talk is based is actually a book on traumatic brain injury and collision sports. I had a remarkable conversation with a colleague who's an international expert on traumatic brain injury and collision sports. And she said, I don't think the American National Football League is a regulated industry. And I almost lost it because that's kind of important to the book project, right? And I said, why not? And she said, well, because they're unregulated completely. And I smiled and I didn't say anything because she's a very important person, right? But to me, what that shows is, in fact, not that they are unregulated as an unregulated industry. And we could think about, I'm South African by birth, so I grew up following international football and soccer. So I understand British Premier League and actually follow it quite avidly as well. So we could substitute Premier League or the World Rugby League, the World Football League in Australia as similar actors. But the National Football League in the US has become so successful so successful that they've actually created and sustained almost a complete regulatory vacuum for decades. And that doesn't mean to me that they're an unregulated industry. It means they have played this game extremely well. They've almost managed to take their pieces off the board. So that's what I mean by the manufacture of doubt. That's what I mean about thinking about it historically. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by a script as we continue. This is, of course, primarily a Western phenomenon. I mean, thinking about global health, but it's got a global reach. I mean, we have to think about sort of larger global health politics in particular, right? This Western phenomenon, this manufacture of doubt, is deeply tied to these larger international political economies. And of course, although I'm not in any way a historian of empire or colonialism, I did want to mention this because, of course, we can't ignore the effects of empire and colonialism in shaping the scope of regulated industries and in shaping their political economies and the objectives that they have. So we can trace the manufacture of doubt through the railroad industry, which is actually where I'm going to start today. The railroad industry, the mining industry in particular. There's some excellent work from Jock McCulloch who on the history of mining and the manufacture of doubt in South Africa in the late 19th, early 20th century. Of course, we can see this in the oil and gas industry as well. Which BP, of course, is part of this story as well. We can see this in the tobacco industry, and again, Brown and Williamson, if we're talking about a British context, right, as well. And the biopharmaceutical industry, which is where I've spent some actual time thinking about manufacture of doubt and conflicts of interest. That's partly how I got involved in this work. Freya noted that I am a trained attorney. I actually practiced pharmaceutical tort defense in the US for about 6 years. So I actually saw some of this. I wasn't directly employed by pharma, but I worked for a law firm that was primary outside counsel in pharmaceutical defense. So I saw some of this sort of hands-on. So thinking about the manufacture of doubt and the script, right? The problem is, of course, right, is that these things vary so much across time and space. Although we can trace some common historical patterns, what I thought is, when I was sort of thinking about this, I think it actually makes more sense to think about what is the manufacture of that? How do we know when it's operating? How do we know when a regulated industry or sophisticated actor is sort of enacting the script, right? When they're performing the script, or they may be adding something and innovating, because that happens too, right? There's always sort of new techniques, new rhetoric, new ideas, new work, new innovation that's being involved, that's being sort of purveyed by these very, very sort of affluent and powerful and sophisticated political actors, right? So instead of sort of defining in a very necessary and sufficient sense the manufacture of doubt across sort of, almost 200 years of time and space, what I sort of thought is it's better to really think about this in a Wittgensteinian sense, right? I'm not going to sort of beat anybody over the head with Wittgenstein, I promise, right? But the basic idea is that there's a family resemblance, right? And the more of these, what we call, and this is Wittgenstein's idea, right? The more of there are these characteristics that you can look for that make it more likely that there's a family resemblance between sort of different sort of cousins, right? Or different entities. And so that's the kind of idea. We're not looking for a sort of strict and sort of unitary definition. Like, in this context, we absolutely have the manufacture of doubt. And in this context, maybe we don't. It's really more about looking for characteristics that are sort of giving us increased confidence, right? That we're seeing the script of the manufacture of doubt being enacted, right? So in the underlying book project, I have a whole list of them, and it's under editorial review right now. So unfortunately, I can't share all of them, but I thought I would give you all some examples of some of the script making characteristics. Like, what are some things that these regulated industries do that look like the manufacture of doubt? They look, smell, and sound like the manufacture of doubt, right? So that's just sort of the point. And you can see these ideas of social scripts, again, they're not destiny, they enact, they innovate, they look different, right? So what are some key script making characteristics? And these are just some examples. I think I traced about 8 or 9 of them. And that was just, to be honest with you, pretty arbitrary in some of the underlying work. There's more, of course. And like I said, it's fluid and permeable. It's not one thing only. The script changes all the time. Scripts aren't destiny. If we think about the idea of a social script, which is, of course, a concept also borrowed from behavioral science and anthropology as well in particular, right? So one of the things that companies have done, regulated industries have done, is employing company physicians. and health professionals in particular to review illness and injury claims of workers and consumers, workers who claim they're injured in the production and manufacture of whatever products are being marketed by the regulated industry, and consumers and users actually being harmed by this, right? And we'll talk about this. We see this with the railroad industry. They actually pioneered this. This is actually still going on with the example I gave of collision sports. Most of them, whether it's Premiership in the UK or Bundesliga or any of the other big soccer leagues or World Football League in Australia or the National American Tackle Football League in the US, they all have company healthcare professionals. They all do, okay? So that's number one. Number two, accusing injured or sick workers and consumers of malingering and feigning illness for the purposes of shoring up claims made in litigation. This is a tried and true tactic. This was also pioneered in important ways by the railroad industry, but it's been used by almost every regulated industry that I've mentioned or can think of, to be honest with you, that is sort of accused of, again, injuring or damaging population and public health. I actually do quite a bit of work on malingering in general. If you're interested in that, please feel free to follow up and contact me, because I definitely have I curated a symposium issue of a journal on accusations of malingering and their presence in social policy in particular. And then the third one, which is of course what I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time today talking about, is disputing causation between the product in question and adverse health. So I'm not going to talk about that right at the moment. I'm going to sort of give you all some sense of the other ones. There's my GIF, my meme. I like GIFs and memes, right? So that's the Princess Bride, okay? So why is that there? So one of the benefits I think of thinking about railroad industries as, should be able to stop this GIF, oops. One of the benefits of thinking about railroad, the manufacture of doubt as a historical script, thinking about it sort of using the lens of history, is I think the story actually starts much earlier than most people who talk about regulated industries and the construction of agnotology start. Most people, when they're analyzing it, they sort of think about it on its own terms. And even as gifted a historian as Robert Proctor, and this is not a criticism, of course, because Proctor's work is fantastic. You know, when he writes The Golden Holocaust, he's really talking mostly about the tobacco industry and the history of the tobacco industry. I think if we sort of enlarge our scope a little bit to think about agnotology and the manufacture of doubt in a little bit broader sense, I think it actually becomes much more important to think about the railway industry. And I and some colleagues, I have a colleague, Stephen Casper, who I'm trained in the UK actually, and is a very well-known historian of neurology and nervous injury in particular. We've had several of these conversations. And in fact, some of the work that I've been talking about malingering actually came out of conversations with Dr. Casper, because and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm pretty sure we're in agreement of the significance of the railroad industry here, right? Of really, as a regulated industry that by hook or by crook really was forced to pioneer a lot of what we see as these script-making characteristics of the manufacture of doubt. And they didn't invent this just because out of some sort of whim or caprice. They sort of started to craft these tools and these script-making characteristics because they were forced to. Why were they forced to? Because railways remain actually a fairly hazardous industry, for those of you who are curious. Less so for passengers these days, much more so for workers. It's an occupational health issue. In the 19th century, they were incredibly hazardous to both workers and to passengers in particular. You know, railroads, I mean, in the airplane era, we are sort of less accustomed to thinking about the massiveness of railroads and the incredible speeds at which they can move huge amounts of weight, right? And so they're capable of causing immense trauma and injury. And so what we see in both the US and the UK, so here I'm talking in more of an Anglophone context, is a late 19th century rise in private litigation out of tort. Right. And so people started basically to sue railroads, and it was both workers who were suing them and passengers who were being injured in railway accidents and railway crashes. And there's, of course, some great railway injury history work that's done in the UK, and I track some of the groups who do that excellent work. But these suits were starting to become a serious problem for the railway industry, and again, on both sides of the pond, and it had an increasing impact on industrial revenues. And so what happened was railways began to hire physicians, right, both to provide care for their own injured workers, but also to prepare expert defenses against injured parties, right? So we actually know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. Ralph Harrington has done a lot of good work on this. There's some excellent work on the history of railway medicine and railway injury. And so the railways hired physicians because they kept getting sued, but the physicians were ostensibly hired to provide direct care to injured workers. And don't think the injured workers didn't know what these railway physicians were up to, because they definitely did, by the way, okay? But to sort of lay the groundwork for a defense against any ensuing litigation that might come first from injured workers and then actually from injured passengers, because railway companies actually sent their physicians to examine and take care of injured passengers as well. And again, this happened on both sides of the pond. It was very active, right? So I just wanted to mention this in passing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this particular script making characteristic. In some of my other work, I do spend a lot of time talking about malingering and accusations of feigned illness and malingering. These are just some examples, right? But the idea is that these company physicians would use their sort of expertise to help develop railway companies' medico-legal strategies for denying the responsibility for any injuries that were caused by their behavior. And so one of the ideas here is something I'd mentioned or a couple slides ago, is that the idea, and this developed in the late 19th, early 20th century. We can see it. I've actually had the privilege some years ago of doing some research at the Wellcome Library, where you can actually find manuscripts where the physicians and papers and pamphlets where the company physicians are actually talking about litigation neurosis and traumatic neurosis. And this was sort of deemed a sort of psycho, it wouldn't be called psychosomatic in the early 20th century, right? But the sort of psychosomatic injury that would magically disappear, right? Once the litigation settled or once a settlement was reached. So this is a page from Shobal Vale Clevenger, who's an American railway physician, his 1889 treatise on spinal concussion. You can see what he says, recovery was good ground from which to suspect malingering, fraud abounded in most of the claims made. It would be interesting to be able to examine the records of the plaintiff's lawyers in these cases. Wouldn't it indeed, is what I would say to Mr. Clevenger, right? And we can get some of these records in the US, although not a lot. Plaintiff's lawyers didn't keep a lot of these records. So contemporary historians like Bill Bynum, for example, have even referred to railway spine. It was also called spinal concussion. It had a lot of different names because nosology's disease categorizations in the 19th century are very fluid, but it would be referred to as 19th century whiplash. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one in particular. I just wanted to give you a sense of a different script making characteristics that railway companies and the railway industry in particular helped to pioneer, right? But in particular, this is the main one, okay? This is the one that I think is still probably most powerful. We see this all around us for those of you who are curious, okay? So I mentioned that I'm working on collision sports and traumatic brain injuries in particular. This one is also quite powerful and hot in the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, right? Where we don't quite see as much of a regulated industry trying to pervade the manufacture of doubt, but we do have some other sophisticated actors sort of disputing causation, right? And why does this develop, right? One of the ways, and who's most responsible for developing the tools and the methods that's used to dispute causation. And the tobacco industry really perfected this technique, okay? And they're not the only ones. I'm not saying they were the first to do it. In fact, they weren't. And they're certainly not the last because, like I said, it's going on all around us. But the tobacco industry is most responsible for really sort of pioneering and developing and enhancing and refining the use of this technique. And why did they do it? And Proctor's work, as well as many others, Sarah Myloff has a new book on, and Alan Brandt have all talked about this in their work on cigarettes and the tobacco industry in particular. But basically, the problem is, you have a number of different options for sort of hiding these epidemics, right? The one is you can deny the existence of a health problem. But as you can probably imagine, by the late 1950s and the early 1960s, increasingly, it was pretty much impossible for the tobacco industry in particular to deny the evidence of harm that was accumulating in association with their products, right? They couldn't deny by the early 1960s that a lot of people who were smoking seemed to be developing emphysema and lung cancer, right? So they couldn't really, even in the public sphere, right? Even where the credibility of most of these regulated industries in the public discourse and in public reason is not good, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later, you can't deny the harm. It's difficult to deny the exposure if we're thinking about this from an epidemiologic perspective, right? That link between that exposure outcome. On the one hand, we know the outcome, people are getting sick and getting hurt. On the other hand, we know the exposure, people are smoking, right? Or people are consuming tobacco products in particular, right? So what's left is to deny the link, the causal link between exposure and outcome, and not even necessarily deny, but to manufacture doubt on the strength of a causal inference that's justified between the exposure and the outcome. And that's what the tobacco industry has perfected. And that's what really I'm most interested in sort of talking about the rest of it, our time today, right? That it's impossible to deny that the products are dangerous themselves, okay? That people who are consuming or using or working around these products are getting sick, are becoming harmed. It's impossible to deny the harm as the outcome, but it is always possible to deny the warrant for the causal inference. And why is it possible? In part, it's because for those of us who know anything about epidemiologic and disease causation, it's extraordinarily difficult, right? Because what happens is there are always too many confounders as to sort of health and health outcomes, right? There are all sorts of reasons why some groups of people or some people might have some health outcomes that differ from other groups of people. And it's very, very difficult to control for all of the different influences on public and population health. And so it becomes very difficult to decide under what circumstances a correlation that we're finding between an exposure and an outcome actually represents a true causal relationship, right? And this is in partly why epidemiologists are not ignorant of this. Causal inference is practically a field unto itself within epidemiology, right? And I speak as someone who, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I am appointed in the Department of Epidemiology. And I think and work a lot in and within and with epidemiologists all the time. You know, causal inference is the name of the game in a lot of epidemiology, right? And it has its own attention. There are causal inference labs. There's one at Harvard, for example, right? I mean, there are epidemiologists who literally spend their entire careers working on causal inference because it's so difficult. And there's what's referred to the aphorism, at least in the US, is there's what we would call the thin end of the wedge, right? That's where these regulated entities sort of insert the wedge and they start sort of pushing it open a little bit. It always becomes possible to deny the warrant for causal inference, right? And we're going to dig in a little bit more and find out why this is so effective, right? And one of the ways to look at this is through an example, right? So I've done some work on the pharmaceutical industry in particular. Like I said, I have a background sort of in that industry and sort of thinking about this a little bit. And so about 6 years ago, I wrote a paper on this idea, unreasonable standards for proof of harm. And what happens is, you know, I've been studying conflicts of interest in particular between healthcare professionals and regulated industries, pharmaceutical industry, biotechnology industry, medical device industry. And these conflicts of interest are rampant all over the world. They're especially rampant in the US and the West, but it's not a US phenomenon alone. It's a global phenomenon, just like the pharmaceutical industry is global. I'm not going to take you through this huge argument, so don't worry about it. I just wanted to sort of extract a couple different things to highlight this in particular, right? So I became fascinated by this, right? Because what would happen was people who were interested in preserving, because that's usually what happens with the manufacture of doubt, preserving a status quo in which physicians in particular, but healthcare professionals can enjoy deep entanglements and relationships with pharmaceutical industries. When this was objected to as problematic, the response would be, well, show us the evidence of harm. And they're not denying that there's harm associated with pharmaceutical products, because of course there are certainly who would deny that. What they're denying is the causal link between the exposure, which in this case is a relationship between physicians and the pharmaceutical industry, and the outcome, which would be harm, right? So for example, in the US, we have a terrible drug overdose crisis that's been going on since about 2007. And we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the first wave of the drug overdose crisis was connected to overwhelming marketing of certain kinds of pharmaceutical products from drug companies. We know that this is pretty much true beyond a shadow of a doubt at this point, right? So those relationships actually have a dramatic effect on how many of these products are being sold and how many of them are being consumed, which means it has a pretty direct impact on the harm, whatever harms that are flowing from the utilization of these products, right? So I sort of became interested, like, wow, like what evidence of harm or of a causal link between the exposure, the relationship, and the outcome, the utilization or the increased utilization of these products would actually satisfy people, right? And so this was the argument that I sort of laid out. And in particular, right, I want to draw your attention to premise 3 and premise 4 down there, right? That's what I'm most interested in, right? So the first 2 or 3, I think, are actually pretty uncontroversial, right? That we have to show harm to patients. And the only way we can show harm to patients is by clinically meaningful outcomes, right? And that we require proof of causation that links the exposure and the outcome. None of this should be especially controversial for anyone who's thinking about epidemiologic causation, but it's number 4. That's where for those of you who are interested in, that's where the political economic action is happening. It's happening at P4. Proof of causation linking exposure and outcome can be generated only via a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial. Now, that's actually a pretty strong statement, right? But oftentimes, when we're talking about unreasonable standards, unreasonable demands for proof of causation, that's what we're talking about. The demand that's being made by regulated industry or by proponents, right, or opponents of regulatory action or political action or interventions, right, public health action in general, is that the quality of the evidence that justifies an inference of causation from the exposure to the outcome is insufficient. And that technique was really, although we see it in mining, like I said, in the early 20th century, in asbestos, it's been shown, the asbestos industry, the lead industry, lead paint in particular, this has been shown as well. But it's really the tobacco industry that perfected this in the middle decades of the 20th century, right? In which they would say, look, we know people smoke, there's the exposure. Right? We know people are getting sick, there's the outcome, but you just don't have the quality of evidence you would need, right, to be able to generate and warrant an inference, right, that the exposure is actually causing the outcome. And we see this again and again and again. If you're interested in some of the things I've been talking about traumatic brain injury and collision sports, it's exactly what we see, which is pretty much why I just decided to write a book about it, right? It's a demand for proof of causation that can be proved by what's been referred to as this gold standard, right? That we have to conduct this double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized control trial. And if we don't have that, then we have insufficient evidence to warrant an inference that the exposure is actually causing the outcome. At best, we have an association, and who knows why all these professional athletes participating in collision sports are actually developing long-term neuropathology. It could be for all sorts of different reasons, right? We're not justified in the assertion that there is a causal link between the exposure and the outcome, right? So what's the critique of this? What makes this, because I promised you all I was going to explain why it was unreasonable, right? Because I don't think that's a reasonable claim, okay? I think P4 there is profoundly unreasonable for a number of different reasons, okay? The first is that it's actually unreasonable on its own grounds. And what do I mean by that, okay? It's fallacious in its own right. Well, first of all, randomized control trials are great, but anybody who studied hierarchies of evidence-based policy and evidence-based public health and evidence-based medicine understands that there's lots of situations in which a randomized control trial isn't actually a great form of knowledge production, right? There's many circumstances in which it is. I'm certainly not trying to throw RCTs under the bus, but we have plenty of sort of, decades of evidence that suggests, A, of course, there are better and worse randomized controlled trials. So just because you have one doesn't mean it's of good quality. And B, there are all sorts of important population health questions and public health questions that we might want to answer that are not very well answered by a randomized controlled trial, right? Which, for example, so I work on chronic pain a lot. And one of the things we know, because I spend a lot of time, thinking about the lived experiences of people with chronic pain, is if you want to know the lived experiences of people with chronic pain, you're definitely not going to want to conduct a randomized controlled trial, okay? Because that's not that homogenizes groups of people together. It tries to actually squash difference so that we can get a sense of internal validity, right? To justify sort of an inference of a treatment effect, right? So if you really want to know, for example, the lived experiences of people living with a particular condition, say like long COVID, for example, right? You wouldn't say a randomized controlled trial is the most important form of study, right? So that's number one, that actually it's fallacious in its own right, that like some forms of evidence and knowledge production actually look like they're better suited for different kinds of methodologies and research designs and study designs than randomized controlled trials, just taking them on its own terms, right? But I actually think there's a more powerful argument than that one, right? And the more powerful argument is this, right? That if we required proof of an exposure outcome link via randomized controlled trials, we would essentially gut public health action completely. We wouldn't have much public health. Why? Well, because we generally can't, for those of us who know anything about how epidemiologic studies have to consist, we generally, for reasons of both cost and ethics, and I'll talk about what I mean by those in a moment, we generally cannot conduct a lot of randomized controlled trials in epidemiology, right? Most of the public health science, the epidemiologic studies we conduct are some form of an observational or a cohort study. Now, why? Why is that true? Why does it have to be that way? Well, say, for example, you wanted to determine the level of benzene exposure that would produce neurological harm in kids? Because that seems like an important thing to know. How much exposure to benzene is too much? Well, how would we conduct a randomized controlled trial on that to determine it? Well, here's what we would do. We would have a control arm, and then in the experimental arm, we would take children and we would expose them to increasing levels of benzene until we observed a quote unquote treatment or an experimental effect. And I think all of you who are listening, hopefully, are sort of wincing because we all understand that we can't do that, that is completely unethical, that we cannot expose, participant populations to known risks of harm, even to generate knowledge that would be important for a public and population health perspective, right? It is unethical. It is frequently unethical to do randomized controlled trials in an epidemiologic context. We can't do that. The best we can do is create cohorts where we're observing what happens to these participant populations, right? As a result of an exposure that they've already had, which we're not introducing, right? If we're introducing it, that looks more like a randomized controlled trial and there are problems. In addition to which, of course, in an epidemiologic sense, the arc of time can be years and decades, right? If we wanted to observe an outcome from a given exposure in an epidemiologic context, like say the effects of, exposure to benzene in childhood, we might have to keep people in a trial for decades, right? Which is completely unfeasible in terms of cost and methodologically almost impossible, right? Because you're going to have so much loss to follow up. You're going to have people moving in and out of the subject population. It's going to be impossible, basically, to do a trial. So randomized controlled trials in the vast majority of epidemiologic contexts are infrequent. I don't want to say they never happen. We do have some randomized controlled trials in epidemiology, but they're certainly not common, right? Not as common as we might want them to be for those of us who think that often they help us produce good evidence, right? So the point is that if we demanded proof of causation by double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials, and that was the basis on which we perceived or maintained an evidentiary warrant for acting or for intervening in the name of public health, we wouldn't be doing much public health, to be honest with you. The vast majority, overwhelming majority of our public health interventions are based on lower, we think, sort of less good evidence than we might like. Even if we all agree that, hey, it would be awesome to have way more randomized controlled trials. I'm not saying we would all agree on that, but even if we did, we basically could not do that for reasons of ethics, for reasons of efficiency, for reasons of time, for reasons of cost. It's almost impossible, right? So if we relied on only that form of evidence as a warrant for public health intervention, we wouldn't have a lot of public health intervention, to be honest with you. We wouldn't be doing much public health, right? Which in the US seems to be what actually people are after these days, is us not doing a lot of public health. But unreasonable demands for proof of causation, what they really do, what they're really expert at is they violate the precautionary principle. And so I'm going to talk a little bit as we sort of get towards the end of the conversation here. What do I mean by the precautionary principle? And what I mean by this, the precautionary principle, unfortunately, is widely misunderstood as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not the first person to say this. There are people who are much more expert on sort of the theory of the precautionary principle than I, who argue that, in fact, it's widely misunderstood, including by its proponents and including by those who are sort of interested in it, right? And so I'll sort of lay out a concept that I find most useful, which is primarily taken from philosopher of science Daniel Steele. So he's got a 2015 book on the precautionary principle that I think is really helpful in grounding it. Like, what is it, right? And how do we know how to operate? And Steele says that the precautionary principle is confusing because even though it was introduced in the late 1960s, early 1970s in a global environmental health context, right? In particular, the Rio Accords, I think, is where in the early 1970s is where we first see it happening on sort of an international political sense. But it is actually a lot of different things at once. And that's why it's confusing, okay? So he says that the precautionary principle is at once described as a procedural requirement that constrains policymaking. It's a decision rule that aims to guide choices among different policies we might select. And it's an epistemic rule. It's a knowledge condition. And actually, I think he thinks, I'm not sure, I might have to ask Dr. Steele, okay? I think he thinks the third one is the most important of these. I definitely think the third one is the most important of these, okay? At least for the purposes for which I'm sort of interested in talking about the manufacture of data. It might be other aspects of these, of the precautionary principle might be more important in different kinds of contexts, but I'm particularly interested in that third one. And the reason I'm particularly interested in that third one is because to me, I have actually developed an argument, and I don't think I'm the only one, although I've definitely said it in print. It was in the paper that I was referencing earlier, where I sort of took the premises on physicians in the pharmaceutical industry. But I actually think the precautionary principle is not just something we can use and apply in public health. I actually think it's arguably the basis for public health action writ large. It's actually a justification for intervening in the name of public health, precisely because it relaxes the standards of evidence that's required to justify public health action. The stricter our demands for proof of causation, the less public health action is going to be warranted, the epistemic warrant for intervening in the name of public health, because as I think most people who are living and breathing through this pandemic understand, right, public health action often imposes costs on people. Right? It certainly imposes costs on regulated industries, by the way. We know that that's true. That's basically the whole justification for the manufacture of doubt as a script, right? So it imposes these costs, which means we need a warrant. We need an evidentiary warrant. We need to understand the knowledge conditions under which a particular public health intervention is warranted or justified. And what the precautionary principle basically does is it relaxes the standards of evidence that are required to justify that public health action. Because if they were very, very strict, if we demanded proof of causation by double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials, we would not have a lot of public health action, which, by the way, is exactly what the tobacco industry and other regulated industries want. They don't want a lot of public health action. So for them, it makes perfect political and economic sense to pose unreasonable standards and demands for proof of causation. What's the goal? To sustain those regulatory vacuums, right? And so they can sustain the regulatory vacuums by posing very strict requirements for the kind of evidence that would warrant a causal inference between the exposure and the outcome. And the reason this, I think, is infirm and problematic is because it basically guts the precautionary principle. The whole reason the precautionary principle, I think, exists is to justify public health action writ large. Right? That's why we can do public health. We can do public health precisely because we don't have the strictest demands for the kinds of evidence that would warrant that causal inference. Of course, most of us working in public health want the very best evidence we can get. We want to know under what conditions a causal inference is really justified based on the sort of quanta of evidence that we've developed. So I'm not sort of saying we shouldn't try to get the best evidence we can. We absolutely should, but we can sort of relax a little bit because of the precautionary principle. It tells us, look, public health action in general, where there's a known risk of harm, and especially where that risk of harm has an unequal impact on marginalized communities in particular, right? You're warranted in intervening. You're warranted in intervening, right? And that the kind of evidence we develop from observational studies, from cohort studies, if they're done well enough, right, is more than sufficient to justify precautionary behavior, more than sufficient to justify public health action. The precautionary principle is based on the idea that a relatively large amount of uncertainty, admittedly more than most of us might like, including me, and I'm a public health fanatic in case you can't tell, okay? But a relatively large amount of uncertainty about the causal link between an exposure and an outcome does not vitiate the justification for intervention. That's literally what the epistemic component of the precautionary principle is. And so I think these sort of demands for strict proof basically are unreasonable because they basically deny what to me is the epistemic warrant for public health action of almost any kind. Like, that is not reasonable as far as I'm concerned. We might disagree, which I'll talk about in a moment in the next slide, on the line drawing that has to be done with the precautionary principle. And that's what makes most people anxious about the precautionary principle, because it looks like it's just a blank check. It could justify almost anything based on almost any quantum of evidence that we develop, no matter how poorly done, for example, a particular cohort study is. And that is a problem, by the way. But I don't think that actually saves a lot of the regulated industries making these unreasonable demands. And there I note that the precautionary principle is known to be especially important where you have a potentially large magnitude of harm. The impact of the harm could be severe, right? And it's known that harm is most likely to be visited on marginalized and oppressed communities, right? So we have to think a little bit about justice and equity in how we contemplate and apply the precautionary principle. So these limits are important, okay? And at the margins, the precautionary principle can be difficult. For those of you who are wondering about that image there on the left, that for those of you who don't know, the phrase "doubt is our product," this whole idea, doubt is our product, it was taken from a tobacco executive's memo, actually. And this was unearthed in the tobacco litigation in the US in the early 1990s. So of course, Robert Proctor's written about this, and David Michaels, who is an epidemiologist and a former health official in the Obama administration as well, an occupational health and safety expert. He has a whole book called Doubt is Our Product, basically, okay? So yes, it's true. At the margins, the precautionary principle can be difficult. Understanding when does the precautionary principle license us to intervene? When does it say, yes, you can intervene in the name of public health? You can impose costs and burdens on those to whom a public health intervention might be impacting, right? And when is it insufficient to justify a particular, maybe it's an especially burdensome intervention, right? At the margins, there's no doubt, it can be difficult to apply the precautionary principle, which is partly why I think we need to understand it better than a lot of us do who are sort of operating with it. And I include myself in that, by the way, because until I started sort of really studying and thinking about it, I was using it inappropriately, I think, as well, okay? But unreasonable demands for proof of causation that we're seeing from regulated industries, they can't really hide behind this, as far as I'm concerned, because they're not asking for drawing a line in a different way. As far as I'm concerned, they're basically gutting the precautionary principle entirely. They're just saying it doesn't apply in this case. Like, they're just saying the fact that the precautionary principle enables us to relax the standards of proof we would need of causation to justify action is irrelevant and immaterial. They're basically squashing and ignoring the precautionary principle, and that's not plausible, right? And I understand why the regulated industries are doing it. We know why they're doing it, right? They're doing it to create and sustain regulatory vacuums, but it's not reasonable. And it's, speaking as an ethicist, I think it's unethical, right? This is a key operator in the manufacture of doubt, right? Again, to sustain, create, or even fuel this sort of regulatory vacuum. So this is the last slide, I promise. Then I'm sort of interested to get some feedback and hear what you all think about this. But I did want to sort of talk a little bit about the way that this is used to sort of, and this is thanks to Freya in particular, who's prompting me to think about this a little bit. About sort of how this relates to hidden epidemics. Hopefully you can all see some connections. I mean, I see plenty of connections, but just trying to sort of flesh this out for the group, in particular members of the group who are here. Unreasonable demands, the point sort of thinking about all of this, unreasonable demands for proof of causation are key strategy in the manufacture of doubt. Historically, we can show that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Again, we can trace that script making characteristic at least as far back as about 170 years, right? So it's been there. Of course, it was really, like I said, perfected and refined by the tobacco industry. And so it's not an accident, for example, that regulated industries that have succeeded the tobacco industry are there paying attention, right? These are very sophisticated political actors, right? They know what's going on. They're paying attention. They know what the tobacco industry did, and they know how successful the tobacco industry was. The tobacco industry, despite being they're still the #1 preventable cause of morbidity and mortality on the planet. I think it still is. It definitely is in the US, and I think it still is globally, to be honest with you, right? Despite that, they were able to forestall any significant regulatory action for over 4 decades. And in the process, we're talking about immense morbidity and mortality, right? I mean, millions and millions of people getting sick and dying, right? So the tobacco industry perfected this, but we can also see industries that have come along after the tobacco industry enacting this historical script, right? So it's not an accident that when the American National Football League commissioner in 2010 was called before the US Congress to testify, one of the legislators who was interrogating this person actually said, you're just like the tobacco industry. And that was not an accident that she said that, right? So this is a key strategy in the manufacture of doubt. We see this over and over and over again. This is both past and present. Sometimes the manufacture of doubt, where it's possible, is used to suppress the existence of a health problem at all. Sometimes earlier on, and sort of the sort of where this regulatory sort of vacuum is unfolding, sometimes initially it becomes possible to deny the existence of this health problem. So again, because I'm picking on the National Football League, we can keep going with that one, right? Where early on, sort of in the, we have very good evidence. And again, Stephen Casper is the historian who's been unearthing a lot of this evidence. But contrary to what most people think, the evidence that connects, concerns about neurological injury to collision sports is not novel. It's not novel. It's been around for about 100 years or more. And Dr. Casper has proved this. But the NFL, the National Football League in the US, was very, very successful at suppressing the existence of long-term neurological injury, long-term neuropathology as a sequela of exposure to collision sports, right? In the early 1970s, it really wasn't until the mid to late 1980s into 1990s that the National Football League sort of lost control of the narrative. The evidence of harm became too immense for them to deny the existence of the health problem. And again, that's a pattern that we also saw with the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry used the manufacture of doubt to suppress the existence of health problems connected to the use of tobacco products until the weight of the epidemiologic evidence just became too much, basically in the 1950s in particular. It was just overwhelming, and it was no longer really possible for the industry to deny the existence of it. And so when that happens, the tool that's available for regulated industries to sort of hide what's going on a little bit is to deny the causal link. They can no longer deny the exposure. People are smoking, right? People are playing collision sports, those kinds of things, right? They can no longer deny the outcome. People are actually getting harmed. Yes, there is actually sufficient evidence of harm to say, yes, we have a population health problem here, and we can't deny that the health problem actually exists. So what they do is they switch to denying the causal link as a highly, highly effective means to the end of creating and sustaining and fueling these regulatory vacuums, right? So that's the talk. That's sort of where I am. And there's more, of course, but I wanted to be sure to leave plenty of time for sort of questions and comments. So I'll stop there. And thanks everyone for joining us and your time and attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that. That was really fantastic. I've been told by my co-host that I have to give other people a fighting chance at asking questions before I start throwing everything at you. Just to remind people, if you would like to make a comment, ask a question, anything along those lines, you can either use the little emoji to raise your hand. In fairness, you can probably just weigh in, or you can type it into the chat if you rather I read it out. And also, again, it can be questions, but also feel free just to sort of engage in discussions or observations. So I'll give people a couple of minutes to, formulate their questions before I dive in. And I will stop recording now. So